So my claim is that Paul uses the word ἀκαθαρσία in verses like in Galatians chapter 5 verse 19, Ephesians chapter 4 verse 19, and Ephesians chapter 5 verse 3, and etc. I see it as proof that Paul has supported the follow the dietary laws based on the established uses of that Greek word that encompasses so many different dimensions of uncleanness in the Septuagint. Now I think this whole hermeneutic approach to determine the meaning will be like how the word porneia or sexual immorality is used in the Old Testament. I think the burden of proof falls on anyone claiming Paul has narrowed on the inherent meaning, not on those who accept like the full range of the word. Now I see the Greek Septuagint as the primary text used to determine the meaning of the word. In the Septuagint, ἀκαθαρσία and its related form, things like G0169, are used across multiple forms of like categories of uncleanness. Now, each of these categories are not necessarily a specific biblical name category, but a man-made one to help kind of encompass the whole multitude. I know some of these kind of can overlap, and that includes like the dietary in Leviticus chapter 11, bodily in Leviticus chapter 5 verse 3, ritual in like Leviticus chapter 7 verse 20, and sexual in Leviticus chapter 15 verse 24. Basically, the idea is that the word doesn't just exclusively belong to one group, but a broad term that encompasses a whole categories in a sense. A key thing about this is that the Bible, and especially in that word, doesn't necessarily give a connection or even a definition of moral laws per se. Now, you can argue that something like helping someone else out is moral, while let's say a sacrifice is a ritual law, but they aren't necessarily real categories that are introduced in the text, if you get what I mean by that. Rather, it's better to take the word that is referenced and to use that word as the answer. So, for example, when Leviticus chapter 11 says, anyone who touches that carcass will be unclean until evening, if we take that text to define itself, it shows that what makes someone unclean, unless there is a caveat given. So when Paul uses the word for unclean, it should be best assumed that the word has connotations that are already defined in the text, the Septuagint, that Paul was familiar with. Now, I think a huge piece of evidence that supports the type of hermeneutic approach is the Greek word porneia. To look at what it constitutes as sexual immorality, one must investigate Leviticus chapter 18, and I guess you can say 22, or 20 also, all which can constitute sexual immorality. This includes instances like fornication, prostitution, so this also includes instances like fornication and prostitution. But to be consistent, porneia doesn't appear in the commonly quoted Leviticus chapter 18 and 20 to as sexual immorality. Now, does it necessarily mean that those lists or actions are just like, aren't immoral per se, according to the text, how they define it? No, because if you still use the text, Paul uses, especially in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 1, he connects this type of sexual morality to Leviticus chapter 18 verse 8. Now, this is the type of passage that supports Paul's uses of the word. Even one can assume that the word already indicates sexual sin mentioned in Leviticus. I think this is a big point and will eventually lead to a whole different conversation of Paul's theology, which, I think that's a whole different conversation. But Paul has and was defined in Scripture as someone who studied the law. He knew that to study the law in terms of certain usages. If scholars or anyone accepts that porneia is in connection with Leviticus chapter 18, even though the word isn't there, I think they have less of a reason to reject that ἀκαθαρσία in the dietary law connection, because ἀκαθαρσία appears in the dietary passages. I think I kind of provided enough sufficient evidence that supports that Paul's uses of the word includes the dietary laws. Some individuals might use instances like Romans chapter 14 or Mark chapter 7 or Peter's dreams as counters, but I already created videos discussing common passages like those. I'm making a new one. I don't know. But a common argument is that is used to say that Paul's uses in the word can also mean moral uncleanness instead of ritual uncleanness. And as kind of discussed before, the ideal of moral versus ritual is generally used in like broad and sometimes are really, they aren't really in the definite category defined in Scripture. It's kind of like a man-made type of category distinction. But the idea is that Paul's theology teaches that dietary laws are no longer binding. Therefore, when Paul uses the word, he must only mean moral uncleanness. And since the word only means moral uncleanness in Paul, that confirms that Paul's theology excludes dietary laws. And it goes down to the whole thing of circular reasoning. As a conclusion, Paul excludes dietary laws. It's assumed as the premise, Paul must mean moral uncleanness. Now, if you see, the premise is used to prove the conclusion. The only way to kind of break this circle is to establish how the word ἀκαθαρσία is used independently of the theological conclusion one is trying to reach. something like porneia and what was discussed earlier. And overall, I think overall on purely linguistical and hermeneutical grounds, I think the argument that Galatians chapter 5 verse 19 and similar Paul letters, including dietary letters or dietary laws, is consistent and supported by the words used earlier in Scripture. I think the most common objections include relying on circular reasoning, conflating different Greek words like Romans chapter 14 and Galatians chapter 5, or even importing theological conclusions into the analysis. So basically, I think Paul teaches to keep the dietary commands. So, okay.